On today's episode, we talk about how your value is more than your surplus labor production, unless you're living in a communist society. How the world wars had nothing to do with progressivism so long as you ignore history. Unsolvable problems in libertarianism like roads and poisoned food. And how the government can afford to solve poverty and suffering. Neat. This is Cringe Posts. Welcome to this episode of Cringe Posts. My name is Donald.
And I'm Britt.
And we are here to take on online takes that you see in your feed that make you cringe. You just don't know what to put your finger on, why they're wrong, but man, are they wrong. It just makes you recoil. We're here to take care of that problem for you. Make sure to like and subscribe and share this podcast if we're doing a good job. But before we get on to the main courses of the day, we have to look back and reflect on our own mistakes and cringe moments. And so that's why right now we're going to delve into this wonderful picture from Britt, our co-host here. And as you can see, this photo of a young Brit staring up into a very nondescript canvas because it's just walls. And the caption reads, "I like to stare at walls in awe, haha." No punctuation, no capitalizations. Just, I will say, on the bright side, you did spell awe correctly, as in I'm standing in awe. You didn't spell it like aw, or sometimes people swap the two. So there's some merit. Other than that, I don't know how much credit I can give you.
Yeah, going through, because we kind of quickly, I at least for me, because I wasn't very political at all or have many political takes when I was younger, but I had a lot of takes on myself, obviously, very narcissistic. And so it's been interesting going back through 2008, and all those years and being like, oh, wow, like I just like taking pictures of myself and doing weird captions that make kind of no sense, and all in an effort to get some likes and attention and all that stuff. I was trying to, because I was like, man, the hub for all this stuff for me was MySpace. Did you have a MySpace?
I wasn't allowed to have a MySpace.
Oh.
I think I created one sort of subversively, but literally never used it. So it's like, why did I even make it? It was more of just to be like, I can get away with this and I'm going to make it. And then did nothing with it. I didn't even have
a computer in your parents' room.
Yeah, well, different. So that's funny. There was actually a different computer downstairs that I probably did it on, which is funny. It was this old Windows 98 laptop or something. But
nice.
I didn't even use it to the point where I didn't even have photos of myself on there. I think I had a picture of fierce deity from The Legend of Zelda as my profile picture, and then literally never touched it. But so yes, I had a MySpace, but effectively no, I didn't.
Yeah, it's just, and we'll do more of these too in the future, but I just remember I had all these little photo projects. I think we've done a few of those, or where I had the little cutout heart and stuff, because I was just I want attention from all of my homeschool online friends and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah. I think I have braces in this too, so it's just it's fantastic.
It's not the highest resolution photo because it is from a decade or more ago. Is there any? Do you know where the walls here are?
That's in the stairwell at my the house I grew up in, my parents' house. So
wow, not even your church or anything. It's literally just your home.
Yeah, just my home.
Was the I don't know, point of this post to be humor? You were sort of in jest.
It was, I think I'm good looking and I want attention, so I'm going to take a picture of me with a white background. I probably had some artistic thing about it because I was like, oh, this is I noticed something about walking down the stairs that looked cool that I wanted to take a picture of. Maybe that's what it was. I don't know. I think it was probably more driven by narcissism than any artistic insight, that I wanted to tell the world.
Well, and I think if there's anything that maybe our less political cringe posts so far have taught us, it's that often the veneer of humor or veneer of artistry is often just sort of the mask for your own narcissism.
Yes.
The cringe post I did a couple weeks ago where I thought I was being really funny and witty, and it was just really to puff up my own sort of ego and things like that. And so I don't know. It's
well, you and I we kind of grew up in a weird time, right? Because I think 2008, so I would have been turning 15 at that time. And it's this is the dawn of social media, right? And we're also coming of age, so we kind of occupy an interesting moment in history in that all of like the angst and narcissism and moodiness of being a teenager hit the incredible power to get instant feedback from millions of people at once. And I don't really like it looking back on it.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? I do think though we almost came at a time when that was very opportune though, because I think as we came into our adolescence, so did social media in many ways. If it just just in its maybe even infancy, to the point where we had a lot of opportunities to utilize and to grow and to experiment and create and build while there weren't a lot of restrictions, while there wasn't like a lot of domineering, but we also didn't have the mass scale where you could get foisted with like child stardom by accident. So it's not like we were posting YouTube videos and getting, a billion hate comments because people online are mean because there's, anonymity. So we almost escaped a lot of the internet, growing up with the internet, but while still growing up with the internet.
Yep.
So we were kind of fortunate in that sense, but we didn't escape without cringes, and that's what I think this post shows us more than anything. We do, in fact, have remnants of our history with us.
I'm hoping I can log into my old MySpace, because that will keep us good for quite a long time. So,
well, I was gonna say while we're talking, I built a website. Probably in 2008-ish, well, probably earlier than 2008, maybe like 2006, 2007. But it has long since been deleted because the hosting site deleted old sites and I couldn't log back in. So there's a treasure trove of Donnie posts that are forever lost.
So sad.
Maybe if someone who works at Brave Host can dig up their old archive, we could dig through that. But
someone's got to back
we'll
up.
move on.
Yep, let's do that.
We'll move on to our first post of the day, which is a post on, looks like Instagram here, and it's an image of Bulbasaur from the Pokemon anime with the caption, "You are worth more than your surplus labor value." Heart. So just kind of like a little cutesy photo there with kind of like
Bulbasaur with the encouragement of the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's just kind of a cringe take because, like, I mean, like, yeah, you have an intrinsic value as a human, but like
that's not what they're trying to say, though. Right?
No, exactly. Yeah. There's a very pointed message for this. It's kind of like if I were to post a picture of Charmander and say, "You are worth more than your labor given to the great state, comrade." Like there's an implication there more than me just saying like as a human you have innate value in the soul and whatnot.
Right. And this is an Instagram page, so I feel like we can say their username, but it's solidarity with all. And so they really harp on like the minimum wage and all these different things. And obviously they're referring right to the Marxist theory of labor, that it's like, hey, like, labor produces, value, and then whatever is over, what it costs for them to produce it is that surplus value. Yeah. So that's why this one really struck me as like stupid and cringy, is because it's like, it like within itself it like contradicts itself, right? It's like you can't be worth more than what you generate, right? In total, nothing would exist if that was the case, because you would. I mean, you are worth more as a person intrinsically, spiritually, all those things. But from a pure like economic standpoint, no, that is you can't. It's an impossibility for you to be worth more than. Obviously there's all these different types of economic theories where you can like talk about value, but just from a pure like looking at a standpoint, if you make and generate $15 worth of value, if a business wants to stay in business, they can't pay you more than $15 to stay in business. So you technically are only worth $15 at the most, $14.99 actually.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting too is even if you were to take this. Take in a way that was like let's try to make it work. You could almost argue from a more free market perspective that you are worth more than your surplus labor value because you have potential to grow and you have potential for creativity and innovation and ideas that you aren't currently putting out there. So in a sense, actually, you are worth more than your surplus labor value because you are worth whatever, whatever people are willing to pay. And that might be worth more than the labor. And it may be worth more than the surplus you're getting for that particular product because it will inspire you to do the next thing. Like Elon Musk as an economic output when he was 16, washing dishes in a restaurant or something, and he's worth whatever surplus labor value it was.
That's called an investment, Donnie.
Yeah,
and
no, exactly.
That requires capital, which is evil, right?
Right. Yeah, but it's just
capital
all these things
is delayed. Yeah, it's delayed return, right?
Yeah. So it's a nonsensical thing. But what's interesting to me too is that this it harps on a lot of the feeling that I think modern day online socialists and Marxists. And I do want to use the term online socialists and online Marxists because there really is a lot of difference in many cases. But the kind of feeling that they want to convey, where this sort of I hate to use the word utopian because it's such a cliche to use, but it really is a utopian vision of what a ultimately communist, what some will ascribe. And I'm not just saying, anything is government action is communism. I mean, like, actually these people who prescribe to these ideologies often want this sort of like fantasy land communism where they say that, you contribute for the good of mankind and everyone is valued and you are valued more than the labor that you produce. But really, when you think about it, nothing could be further from the truth, considering that everyone is seen as an object of labor. So this idea they try to pin on capitalism, like you're only worth the money that you create. It's like, well, no, in a state-driven economy, that's all your merit and value is in service to the state. That's the only lens through which you can see things, because your whatever creativity you may have, whatever produce or production you have, goes to the state. So your only value to the state is a producer for the state goods. Whereas in capitalism, and free market economies, it's like, if you don't want to work, if you find some other arrangement to create value that's not through a traditional means of getting money, like being a stay-at-home mom and like, marrying a husband who creates value and through a job and then provides money to you that way, that's valued, and you're valued in your society for the role you fill there, even if it's not a traditional monetary one, or whatever the case, whatever your arrangement may be. In a capitalist society, your value is through what you can create and provide to others, not to the government. So when they try to put this cozy, you're worth more than your surplus labor value, it's like in the system that
not where you're going,
right? Yeah, the system you're taking us to, that's all I am.
Yep. Yeah, that's great points, man. I'm gonna think on that more. That's I've never thought of it from that angle. So
I don't know. It's really one of those deceptive things where, and that's why I say sort of the online socialist Marxist, because I think a lot of those people haven't actually read the theory, and when you read the theory, I think you come into there are people who've read theory and believe it wholeheartedly. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like once you read the theory, you just become unbrainwashed or whatever. But I think there's an entire generation of people who've only ever heard the stuff that, like socialist Twitch streamers tell them, things like that.
Yes.
And they get this feeling about it without actually thinking it through. And that's kind of one of the effects I see from it. So
yeah, that's good.
All right. And we'll move on to our next post, and this is on Twitter. It is a reply to Dave Smith, so we'll read Dave Smith's tweet first, and then we'll move on to the reply. So, Dave Smith tweets, "Progressivism gave us public schools, the Fed, the income tax, 2 world wars, the FBI, CIA, and the welfare state. Pop CRT, critical race theory, claims that free markets are inherently white supremacy. Yet, when I attack woke progressivism, some libertarians get upset. That tells you something." And to this, our cringe post replies, "Progressivism gave us World War is an insane take." And this, and genuinely, I don't know if this is a hardcore Republican or a hardcore Democrat. All I know is it's hardcore ignorant.
Yeah. Yes. I wonder if this person knows who was president at the time of, because I'm assuming they know that 2 world wars happened, although right. Given a take like that, they might not. But yeah, it's like, okay, who was the president that ushered in the progressive era?
Yeah. Well, you think about the not even that. It's like, which 2 are the most progressive? Like if you just like sort of lay out, like, name the top 5, progressive presidents, there are 0 lists that would not include those 2 presidents during each world war.
Yes. And for those of you who don't know, you're trying to pretend like you do know, we're talking about Woodrow Wilson and FDR.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, like, it's just funny because I do think there's a lot of our all of our education is very geared towards World War II for one thing.
Yeah.
And so World War I gets very much lost in the weeds, which is super important
It's
to knowing why
horrifying.
World War II exists in the first place. And so it's like, even if you didn't buy that World War II was on the back of progressivism in and of itself in sort of a vacuum, you'd have to look, well, why did World War II happen? And then you'd look back, and it's the policies and the enactments from World War I. And then you have to look at what happened in World War I, and you realize it's Woodrow Wilson and his, like America was very resistant to get into the war until an ideologue drove us into that war, and wanted to make sure that we were building the world safe for democracy.
Yes, yeah. I was actually having a conversation with some family members about this, and particularly like, well, because we're I think both you and I are very anti-war in general, and people will frequently cite like, well, a good war that we fought was World War II, and it's like, okay, like. I guess you could kind of like in a vacuum say, yeah, we were fighting against someone evil that was killing, a bunch of Jews. We didn't really know that at the time until we won. But now you have to ask yourself, okay, how did we get there, right? How did we get into World War II? And it's like, oh, you got Woodrow Wilson that really desired us to spread democracy, loaded a bunch of people up onto Lufthansa, sent them over so they could get sunk by a German U-boat or submarine, right? And get us into there. And people are like, no, there's no way that our government would do that. And you're like, okay, have you ever heard about like Operation Northwoods, right? Where
Yeah,
it's like,
right.
And they're like, and I tell them, I'm like, okay, so like here, the military industrial complex and all these generals and security folks want to shoot down our own planes and blame it on Cuba so that we could go to war with them. You're like, no way, that's a conspiracy theory. I'm like, you can go to the Library of Congress online and you can type those words in and you will see the documents that have been declassified.
Just a study of personality. If anyone doubts that the government can and would want to do this, you don't even need to look at like official government documents and things. Read about J. Edgar Hoover as a human, and realize that he was in such a position of power to do things like this, even if it wasn't like the military. Specifically, it was. I mean, you lead to outcomes that involve the military.
Yep. And so Woodrow Wilson wants to get us into World War I. He does, right? Because World War I was initially like a really bad treaty issue with all these interconnected treaties between all the European nations so that, when one person gets killed and one country declares war on another, everyone gets pulled in to fight each other. And ideally with a war, right, when a peace deal is negotiated, because both sides have fairly lost, right, like they've fairly gone at it with each other, the peace deal is going to be somewhat okay in some form or fashion. When the U.S. and outsider entered in, right, we're trying to protect the interest of a lot of the banks that had loaned money to various sides over there during the war, and we'd made it a big lopsided thing. And then we decided, okay, we got to war guilt the Germans, right? We've got to make them pay all this stuff. We're going to blame the entire war on them. And that, as part of Wilsonian, the progressive era and his entire, edict of like wanting to spread democracy and reshape the world because he's smart and can control it and all these things. And that you can point directly to that. And in fact, Adolf Hitler cites, the condition that we put them into. They estimate they never pay off the debt that we forced on them. By blaming them for the First World War. He directly points to that as like why they need to, nationalize and, make all this stuff that they were doing, right? He used that as a way to prop himself up to become what he became. So I think most people, and I feel like I can, pretty strongly make the argument that our involvement in World War I is what caused World War II.
Oh, without a doubt. I think any historian who would deny that would have a very, very large burden to prove that they were not directly correlated.
But we're not taught that, right? I was taught that. I was homeschooled, right? My history class were pretty darn good. But you ask like most people that went through public school or anything like that learned the general curriculum, they don't get that picture. They just hear, oh, like we had to go save Europe. Yeah,
well, at this point they're just like, no, we had to go kill racists. We had to go kill Nazis. And it's like, you didn't even know the Nazis were racist.
We didn't even know.
Yeah. And recall that when the first pictures were sent back home to the U.S. of these camps after the war was finished, people originally did not believe it. Like they thought it was doctored images, they thought it was false and fake, and the soldiers themselves could hardly believe it when they were going through these camps. So
Yeah, and you think about like FDR too, right? Like FDR always wanted to play the like, oh, I'm reluctant to get into, World War II. I don't want to go over there because the Americans did not want to. Like the general populace was like, no, we're sick of this. Like we're not going to deal with that. And then you come to find out, it's like, oh, like they all knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor literally like a week before they did it, and they didn't take any precautions or let anyone know because they knew, oh, well, if they attack us and it's bad enough, like then I'll have the excuse for me to go over there and do what I want to do. And that's progressivism, right? That's what gave us both world wars.
Right. There were two things I want to say. The first being, and that was my original sort of red pill, if you will, into libertarianism, was not specifically FDR knowing the Japanese were going to attack, but rather our response to Japan's attack when we dropped the first bomb. And they offered to surrender. They said, let us keep our emperor in place and we'll do some negotiations. And we said no, and we dropped the second bomb. Yep. And I was like, because in my high school, I went to a private classical school.
If we invaded, we would have lost all sorts of people.
Yeah, and so we had this debate that was set up, and so you're supposed to take one side on this issue, and so I was assigned to take the side that the bombing was not, the second bombing was not justified, and I was like, what? What do you mean? And so I started reading up and looking up, and I'm like, there's no way. There's no way, because of course after the second bomb, they surrendered, and what did we do? We let them keep their emperor. Like the conditions they offered us were basically met after we killed a bunch of people, and after we took out a bunch of civilians too, right? Like the locations of the bombings too. It was also another thing where I'm like, what do you mean we didn't target like military targets here? Like what? So those kinds of things are what set me.
That was like, I can't remember. There's some memo that it was like purposefully like, hey, we're going to actually select Nagasaki because it's like we know there'll be some civilian fallout.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit hazy on it now, but there might have been in one of the bombings. I think that there was like sort of a cloudy like interference, so they couldn't bomb their original target, and so they rerouted to an area that was more civilian filled, and they're like, well, we're just going to do it. And maybe I'm mistaken on that, but I think that's what I'd read at one point. But,
either way, it was awful.
Right? Yeah. Regardless, it was not military only targets, which could have been hit or should have just not been hit at all. Right. That was my first white pill or red pill, I should say, into sort of the non-interventionist idea, and the idea that like the government is actively not working in our best interests in foreign affairs, which
we built two nukes, we got to use them.
Right. Well, and the conservative idea is a lot of the time, and so after bashing the left for saying progressivism didn't bring us into World War II, a lot of the people on the right will defend these actions just as much, and it's like, you gotta realize the government you're skeptical of, that IRS that's tracking down and targeting conservative or Christian groups and penalizing them. That's that same organization that's dropping bombs abroad. Why do you think they have any more of your interests at heart when they're killing people overseas than when they're forcing you to pay your fines as a conservative organization here?
That's good. Yeah.
So. I don't remember what the second thing I wanted to say was. I started this out by saying two things. I forgot the second, but I might come around to that. But if there's any other thoughts you had, or else we'll move on.
Yeah,
okie dokie. So we'll move on to the next cringe post. This is a reply to a thread, but we'll just read this tweet here. It goes, "You haven't done much reading on philosophy and government. You sound like the anarchists I've met who think that taxation is theft, but can't describe how a large community would fix their roads or make sure your food didn't kill you without it." Oh, man.
Well, let's start with the easy one. With the taxation is theft. If I come to you and I point a gun at your head and say, give me this money or else I shoot, that's called theft.
Yeah, I know.
Pretty easy.
Well, let's be pedantic. Let's grant him that maybe it's not theft. Maybe it's extortion. Okay, much better. Okay? It's like you come over with a gun and you say, you're going to buy my piece of moldy bread. And then you give him $200 and he gives you a piece of moldy bread and says, look, how would you feed yourself without my moldy bread? And there you have it. Taxation is extortion. So
there it is, yes.
This makes me think of another thing that could easily qualify as a cringe post. It very nicely fits in here. So I'll just say it because I've seen this post everywhere. It's the really, really stupid joke. that's just
Ayn
wrong on so many levels. Ayn Rand, it's Ayn Rand, Rand Paul, and Paul Ryan walk into a bar. They ordered, or the bartender gives them a poison drink because there's no regulations and they die, or something stupid like that. Like that's the joke. And then the libertarian follow up is, of course, and then no one frequents that establishment ever. And like the private security, like, yeah, and they go out of business and they lose all their customers because no one wants to go there. And it's like, yeah, what on earth? What kind of person thinks that like every bartender is just out there just like, oh, I can't, all my anthrax I have, I just wish I could put it in these drinks, but the law, man, oh gosh, like who thinks that that's how people operate?
Yeah. I think that specifically it was they drink tainted alcohol and die, right? And
Yeah,
it's like same principle though, right? It's like what kind of distillers are going to purposefully, taint their alcohol? And then if there are distillers that can't, like, they don't have the adequate skill set to properly, manufacture alcohol in a safe way, like, they're not going to be in business for very long, right? It's not gonna. So that's the nice check and balance of the market. It's just funny that they can't conceive of that, right?
I mean, I guess, and to their credit, like in Michigan, you think about the water supply being tainted and people getting, oh, wait a minute. The water supply being tainted was run by a government entity and utility. And then what was interesting was after it was whistleblown and all the results were there, it wasn't fixed for like another 2 or 3 years. And you got to wonder, maybe if in a private market where you aren't forced to give that utility your business, they would have been around in 2 or 3 years. Because the answer is no. Because in a private market, if you heard Dasani was, poisoning, letting lead slip into their water supply and toxic amounts, nobody would buy Dasani anymore. But in that system, the city council wants to blame the governor wants to blame the mayor wants to blame any other official, and they all pass the buck, and the taxpayers sit stuck there paying his theft money or his extortion money.
The roads one, I mean, that's like classic, right? It's funny that this person brings it up like it's some like novelty thing. It's like this has been answered probably more times than any other objective to libertarianism because it's kind of the go-to ever since, anyone ever said, taxation is theft. Well, how would we build the roads? That's like, okay, like I think we actually had a comment on our Instagram a while back. Someone said, they're like, well, like if you built roads, like, and private companies built them, like there would be so many tolls and it would be so awful and it would be so slow to get from point A to point B. And you're like, okay, like let's take a look at this. So let's say that you've got like parking lots, right? Like pretty similar to roads. Like you got to roll some tar and some concrete or asphalt and make that all happen. Private companies build their own parking lots generally. And let's just say every single store had a toll to get into their parking lot. Every single store did. And then there's one store down the road that doesn't have a toll, right? And it's like, man, like I really like going to that one grocery store. They have a little bit higher prices, but I don't have to wait in line. I don't have to pay the toll. Like everything is just way better. Their roads are better. I mean, they're not their roads. Their parking lot's better maintained because, for whatever reason, like it's just better. So I'm going to go there instead. Do you think that all the other stores that have tolls would quickly be like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have this toll because we're losing business to this other, this other store in this company? And that's exactly how roads would be built, right? And the funny fact is, right, is most roads are built by private contractors, right? It's not like it's some government agency that builds it. It's private contractors that engineer it and that build it and that make it happen. And it's usually built because there's a demand for some area, right? And so if anything, roads are not built fast enough. They would be built way quicker by the private, industry, but because people view it as like a monopoly, they just can't conceive of roads without the government.
I think in many cases people just they separate the idea that like people have financial incentive for roads to exist. It's not just like the government builds the roads because they're generous and then we get to sort of play with them. We get to ride our bikes on them. We get to take nice little day drives on them and it's fun. Like there's
by that logic, you could build roads and you could determine where stores pop up by building roads.
Yes. Yeah. There's this really ugly swamp over here. Let's build a road there and then just put a store on top of it. I think that'll make it work. Get rid of that eyesore. No, but like, people forget that there's a monetary incentive, and so it's like whether that's let's talk about residential, right? So people are like, oh my gosh, like well, what about the roads where there aren't going to be businesses? And it's like, okay, then maybe your HOA builds a road infrastructure and you pay a little bit to the HOA. Everyone chips in, so it's not very expensive. They maintain the roads. You can get to where you want to go. The realtors have an incentive when they're building to sell houses there, and the contractors who build the houses initially have incentive for people to be able to get there easily because they want people to buy their homes. Like, there's always incentives. And then if you talk about the rural areas, which is often a complaint I see, like, what about roads for areas that are remote? It doesn't make financial sense. It's like, okay, number one, people who live in rural areas generally choose to move out there or live there, or have been there for a while, and they have ways and systems that work currently. So if there's, and like, let's say we abolish the government tomorrow, roads that came with the government don't disappear. So there can be maintenance, there can be these things. But the people that live in rural areas still have incentives themselves to make sure that they have paths to travel. So whether that means that the road is a different caliber or quality because there's fewer people there and that's what they can afford, that's fine. But there will be serviceable ways for those areas to get resources, because that's literally the story of America, is people going to new rural areas, building up better, and making civilizations around them accessible and better and stuff. So it's like, people act like these rural areas never can change or never can develop, and it's like, well, that's just not true. Like, if there's incentive for you to take charge of that area, or if you can provide that service to that demographic, there will be people who build ways to access areas that are habitable, or that it makes a living for them in some way, shape, or form.
Exactly. Yep. It's human action, right? There's people respond to incentives, and I think about. I know we've talked about this before, because I'm pretty sure we've done a roads one before, but like, which is harder, like rolling some tar, to get from point A to point B, or creating an entirely vertically integrated supply chain to get stuff from China over to the United States? And it's like, it's so complicated. Private business can't do tar on roads. But at the same time, Rockefeller in the 1920s was able to do it without internet or cell phones or anything like that, right? And I mean, we have that today, right? Vertically integrated supply chains by private businesses that get us what we need, whether it is on a road or on the ocean or through the air. They're able to do that. And if anything, government can't. Because people see that, like, interstate highways and these things, they see like, oh, well, resources were allocated to it, but that ignores the fact it's also like, man, what could have been, right? If this was thought out in a way where the people that are the stakeholders in this actually had the power to make that happen or change it. You just don't know, right? But I do know that generally when people have incentives, they do crazy things like I was talking about with vertically integrated supply chains and all that stuff. And so if they can do that, they can figure out how to roll some tar.
Exactly right. And if not, we'll have Domino's do it for us.
Yes.
Whatever pizza. I think it was Domino's. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Domino's that did that paving for pizza project.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we talked about that on the last one, but if you haven't heard of that, look it up. It's really funny. It's really cool. Okay. And our last post of the day comes from verified user and just overall cringe lord Robert Reich. He tweets, "If there's one thing we learned from this wretched pandemic, it's that government intervention can reduce poverty and suffering, and we can afford to pay for it."
This was not that long. This is like 2 or 3 days ago, right? So I'm sure he's kicking himself with all of the different stuff coming out from the Fed about, like, maybe inflation is higher than we thought it originally was. I don't think we can afford to pay it, Robert.
I mean, in the simplest of terms, it's like, you're taking out a loan to pay your bills, and you're like, I guess we could have afforded to pay our bills all along. I mean, it doesn't take a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist to see that, like, even if you believed these things to be true, the pandemic proved none of that to be true.
Yeah, I was thinking about Jerome Powell talking about, like, oh crap, inflation it could actually be higher than we anticipated, and then two, right, because they want to increase the debt ceiling as they always do. Right. You're right. It's like, oh man, it'd be like if a dad in a household said, "Hey son, like, I can't buy that $500 Lego Death Star, like we can't afford to pay it," and the kid's like, like, no, like just raise the debt ceiling, and they, take out more credit card loans and stuff, and then they buy it, and they're like, I guess I could have afforded it all along.
Yeah.
No, you can kind of afford the interest, barely, maybe not at all, but you've got to keep raising the debt ceiling to pay more interest, and it's just unsustainable.
And let's look at his other claims here, like
can reduce poverty and suffering.
Yeah, poverty and suffering. The second of those, very interesting, suffering. Really? You think over COVID, the thing that people were alleviated from the most was suffering? I don't think that that's true in the slightest. And goodness, I'd beg you to look at Australia, because if that's not an indication of the kinds of feelings that people are having right now, and like putting up with and getting, eventually going to boil over. That's kind of where we're going, in my opinion. I don't think that government intervention did anything in reducing suffering, no matter how you shake it, just based on numbers alone in terms of suicide rates, numbers alone in terms of mortality and hospitalization of COVID, which is between 1% and 5%. 5 being if you are very old and have a lot of comorbidities, 1% for nearly most every other demographic that's not at risk in some other way already.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, that like the government can reduce poverty and suffering, and we, right? And they're not talking about like we, like you and I, right? They're talking about like it's always so weird how these leftists and progressives and neocons view the government as like almost that they talk about in terms of that, like, ooh, the government produces something, right? Like it doesn't produce anything. And that's when they're saying like we can afford it. It's like, no, what you're saying is, you can foot the bill for it, and we're going to continue to, take more and more from you just so we can pay these things and keep getting elected and all this stuff. And that's the kind of the big irony, right, about these leftists, is that like they apply business principles to an entity that doesn't generate value in any way whatsoever. And so it's so difficult to like argue with them, because they're not even operating within the same like framework, right? And so it's like you can't really I wouldn't say argue it. You can't really have a conversation with them about it, because it's like, well, no, like when someone says, well, we should pay for healthcare for everyone, and it's like that's the right thing to do, and it's like, oh, like you've conflated like an outcome with how you want to do something, and how you want to do it is not going to get the outcome you want, regardless. But like it's almost impossible for me to separate that, because it's like in what is that book? It's like that Rothbard 60-page book. Anatomy of the State. Were you leaving me out to dry there, or you truly just didn't know what I was talking about?
I just didn't want to misspeak. I was gonna let you. I was gonna let you take the fall there, in case I was wrong on which one you were.
Yeah, the Anatomy of the State. The very first chapter, it's like, he's addressing what the state is not. The state is not us, right? When you talk about like all the German Jews and Polish Jews that were killed, it's not that they committed suicide, right? Like the state killed them. They were part of the German nation at one point, and it's not like so obviously the state is not us. Like it's something else that's parasitic, and it extracts value and destroys it. And it's just so funny that it's like you can't really look at the state as like a private company. You can't. It's not that, right? It doesn't generate things. It doesn't have something you can hold it accountable to.
No, and at best it's shifting and reallocating resources to saying, the government has the ability, we can afford it because we can take the excesses from the top margins of the economy and move them down to the bottom margins. And then you see that this is not functional, because like we said at the start of this cringe post, it really is a loan. It really is adding to your credit card debt, and the economy is artificially moving right now, and it's struggling. So you look at an organization like Dick's Drive-In, which is a Washington state chain. Maybe they expand beyond, I'm not quite sure. They've always had very high standards and pay rates for their fast food workers. It's, like a burger stand. And they just announced that they're increasing their minimum wage to $19 an hour, which is about just under $3 increase from the minimum in Seattle right now, depending on the size of your organization and company. And they're also talking about all their incentives, like how after as little as 6 weeks you can increase that to like 21, and then through different training things, yada yada. And then at the end of the announcement, they talk about how they're reducing their hours because they are just understaffed at the moment. And you're like, hold on a minute. This organization is increasing their wage, yet they're understaffed. Do you think that this pandemic has caused Dick's Drive-In to be able to produce more and become more wealthy? Or is it more likely that the unemployment benefits that the state is pumping into people's has incentivized them to stay at home and not work? And so you have an economy that doesn't create and doesn't generate revenue now. And you have people who are not producing, and they are incentivized to not produce like that. And so places like Dick's are now understaffed, and they have to artificially increase their prices in order to make up the difference. And let's say that Dick's had this on the margins, even though we know, especially the restaurant industry is just absolutely brutal on profit and margins and things like that. But let's say that Mr. Dick's Drive-In had all this money he was just sitting on, like, sitting on a pile of coins like King John and Robin Hood. He now is, like pumping this money downward without increased productivity. And yet you still have the government spending that money inefficiently.
Yeah.
And you still have people incentivized to stay at home. So you've moved money from the top, maybe to some people at the bottom, but you've still created an entire class of workers who aren't creating, who aren't producing. And so the overall economy has slowed down. You have fewer people producing, fewer people creating value of one sort. And at best, you've taken this excess wealth from the very top and moved it to the bottom in a very small way, which is just not the case, is not true at all, because, again, restaurant margins are very, very thin, and you end up hurting the people who are producing, who are keeping the economy moving even in tough times.
Yeah, that your example made me think of two things kind of specific to here in Washington. So the first is like, and this I guess is national, but the eviction moratorium, right?
Yeah.
And it's like part of Robert Reich's thing is that like, well, we can afford to pay for people to not have to pay rent. It's like, well, the landlords still were paying their mortgages, right? And I know there was like some sort of relief bill where landlords could recover that cost, but the vast majority of them did not. I mean, you could see tons of examples where, tenants were not paying for 6, 7, 8, 9, even up 12 months, and the landlord was still footing the bill and hadn't been reimbursed for it. So it's like, when you say we, you don't mean we, you mean certain people that you choose, winners and losers that you select. And then I think about when you're talking about specifically like inefficient allocation of money. And I think about in Washington, we've got this long-term care insurance bill. Or law. It's a law that's coming down. I think the cutoff's November 1st. And so for those of you that don't live up here in the Northwest, basically the state of Washington said, hey, we want people to have long-term health care. So what we're going to do is we're going to levy, a 0.5% tax on your wages every year. Or 50, every year. I think it's 0.5% or 0.058 or 0.58% or something like that. And this is going to go towards the health fund, and we're going to, over the lifetime that you work here, we're going to put this into this fund. And then if you need any sort of long-term health care, after 10 years, we'll pay you up to $38,000. So, for that or $100 per day, which is, I don't know if people have anyone, I've got a grandmother that's in some long-term health care. It's a lot more than $100 a day. I'm pretty sure here in Seattle, you can't, really buy a coffee for less than $100. I'm exaggerating, but it's kind of close in some places. And so I was like thinking about that. I was like, man, that's like nuts. That's like a crazy misallocation of money, because you look at the average salary here in the Seattle area is about $73,000. And so every year, if someone's putting their money in, right, and they get a $38,000 benefit, and let's say they work 30 years, to get that benefit, their return on investments like probably 2 to 3% per year. If you put your money into a mutual fund, the same amount of dollars, like you're putting in $500 or whatever a year into like a mutual fund that has a return of 9.5%, which is the average, you're going to literally have double the amount of money that the state is saying that they're going to do it for it. So where is the rest of that money going? Right, it's going to admin, it's going to bureaucrats and all these different people. And what's so unfortunate about that, right, is that the money that if you put it in like a savings account or a mutual fund or whatever, not only are you going to have a better return, but you're also going to make the whole world a better place, because that money that you put in the mutual fund is going into businesses that actually need capital to like make better products and services, right? So it's kind of a double hit to just bettering of society. And that's what's just. Did you listen to the Bob Murphy appearance on Timcast?
No, I haven't.
Dude, it's really good. You should give it a listen. I listened to Bob Murphy when he was on like Tom Woods and stuff a bit, but like I've never really like sought out his stuff. But he's brilliant. But
I was a big fan of Contra Krugman. So
okay, yes.
Yeah.
Which kind of inspired this podcast a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I only knew him mainly through like Tom Woods and Contra Krugman, which is Tom Woods as well.
Yeah.
But he had this great section where he was talking about where he kind of outlined an alternative to Social Security, where it's like, hey, like with this, like we're going to like let people opt out, and they're going to be able to invest their own money, and it's like it's better returns, right, for the person that's investing their money, and it's also great for the businesses that they're investing their money into as well. And based on that growth, right, like the entire U.S. economy, everyone wins in that scenario, right, because businesses are getting better and be able to grow more, and that if taxation exists, like more of that money is going towards where it's supposed to be, so everyone kind of comes out feeling like they've won. But yeah, it's just crazy destruction of value. Like you can literally point to this bill or this law in Washington that it's like it destroys for an average person $40,000 over their lifetime that they'd work, right? And the bad thing is too is as you pay into this long-term healthcare insurance, like if you move out of state, so like on year 29, if I moved out of state, I can't actually take that healthcare insurance with me, right? So I could have put in $12,000 into it, and then I leave in year 29, and I don't get any of the benefit. It's just, yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
I know because you've done a lot of work with it with the Policy Center and everything. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think what's wild about it is it rather than Robert Reich's take of how the pandemic has proved that the government can and has the ability to reduce poverty and suffering. This bill to me shows that the government has and takes advantage of its ability to get away with highway robbery and not tell anyone about it. I think what's been most shocking is, and so I live in this sort of policy world in Washington State, so I am aware of these things. I'm surprised constantly of how few people just know about it. And the absolute secrecy with which the government has operated on it is wild. They have not made it public. Allegedly, in a few days, they're going to make the opt-out forms for those who already have a long-term care plan available. They say they're adequately staffed. We'll see. I tend to be very skeptical about that. But regardless, and what I think will happen is that there's going to be overwhelming demand to opt out by people who know, because there's no way that this is helpful for people. There is no metric by which this is a good plan unless you as a human can commit to living your entire life in Washington State, and you are so risk averse that you don't want to put something in the private market, and you have so much faith in the government that you think that it is the only stable thing that will be able to back up your money there, which is just so far from the truth. And so far from the historical reality of any sort of program like this. I mean, again, like Social Security in the long scheme is just a very bad version of this, but this is just a very hyper-focused version of that in a sense that's very, very bad. And I think when you put it specifically in the claim that when you tell people, I should say, when you tell people who are either indifferent on politics or sympathetic to the left and they want to help people out of a genuine place from their heart, right? Like AKA non-politicians. When you tell them that this doesn't follow you if you move out of Washington State, I think right there, that single piece of it alone betrays the government's intent and it not being something that's genuinely meant to help people. Because I don't think anyone, politically oriented or not, would think that it's a political decision to want to move states. It's more just like, you might get a job, you might have family situation that arises that you have to move. Like, that's just a very normal, apolitical thing to do. It can be political. You can want to move to leave because of political reasons, but that's it. You can do anything out of political. Like, you can eat at Chick-fil-A every day to try to own the left or whatever. You can make any number of decisions that are politically oriented, but most people would say that leaving your state is not a political decision. And so I think that single piece of it is like, if they were trying to actually help people, even if the government was just inept, if we sort of had this blue pill take that, man, the government just sucks at what it does. They're just inept. They want to help people, but they're just really bad at it. That's why we say, no. The government is nefarious, and it does not care about the people it purports to help. It doesn't want to eliminate poverty and reduce suffering, like bleeding heart believer Robert Reich says. The government is actively trying to take advantage of people because it doesn't follow you when you leave the state. So what good is that for you? It's not. It's good for the house.
Yes.
That's all the state is. It's a casino. They're gambling with your money, and the house always wins. That's the bottom line. The pandemic has shown that time and time again, with governors and other public officials going to birthday parties without masks, going to public gatherings when there were lockdowns, all these kinds of things. So no, the pandemic has showed the complete opposite of what Mr. Reich wants to tell you. Don't buy that just because someone with a blue check mark tells you otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. I don't have any more on this one.
Yeah, sorry, got a little bit on a tangent there, but
no, you're good.
These people, they make me mad sometimes, I wonder why.
Hey, it directly affects us here, so it's I could do a lot with $500. So
exactly. Well, and like you and I are lucky because we are in the know about this, and I would assume that you've probably tried to apply to some long-term care plan, and I know I have, and it's nuts. So come October 1st, I'm gonna be rolling that website up and trying to opt out, because that's the other thing. The state gets to determine whether or not you get to opt out. Once you have a plan, you still have to submit your info to opt out, and they can still deny it. So it's wild. But anyway, enough about that. If you enjoyed the show, please let us know with a like, a share, tell a friend, share it online. The internet's a big void. You've got a voice. You can make yourself known. Share it if you liked it. We'd appreciate it. Leave us a review, all of that good stuff. And if we said anything cringe, make sure to comment. Let us know. Tell us how stupid and evil we are because we want people to die and we don't want roads to be built. Whatever it is that's on your mind, let us know. We're happy to talk with you. And tune in next week for whenever the next one is. It may not be the next week, but probably sooner than that. So tune in sooner than a week for the next episode, and we'll catch you on that one. Take care.
See ya.